Thank you, Stephanie. So I'd like to talk to you today about student acceptance factors, specifically why we should care about them and how we can use student acceptance to shape a successful full-scale implementation. I feel I'd be remiss giving any talk about computer-based testing without first talking about why we do computer-based testing in the first place. For our purposes, or for my purposes as an evaluator, computer-based testing makes a lot of sense in the way it lets us handle and process the data. We can turn our data around much quicker than we can with paper-based tests, and we have a greater level of granularity with which we can examine the data. Additionally, at least in medical schools, the USMLE, our licensing test, has been computer-based since 1999. I know that nursing school and several other professions have also followed suit, and so we're not doing our students any favors by not getting them acclimated to computer-based testing early, and you'll see why that's important in just a moment. Specific to George Washington University, as Stephanie mentioned, last fall we revised our curriculum, changing from a standard discipline-based curriculum to an organ systems-based curriculum. What that means is instead of taking courses in pharmacology, physiology, and gross anatomy, our students now take blocked courses, say cardiovascular and pulmonary, which would encompass all of the relevant pharmacology, physiology, and anatomy for that system. This change left our faculty, in some cases rightfully, concerned that a student might be able to pass all of those organ system blocks without mastering the relevant content for gross anatomy that they would need to pass their board exams. By going to computer-based testing, we're able to tag our questions with those disciplines and track our student performances not just by exam or by block, but by discipline across several blocks. The other way that we're able to tag our questions is we can tag them by learning objectives for the blocks. As an evaluator and someone who has to deal with accrediting bodies, that's important to me because it allows us to show not only do we have appropriate learning objectives for each of these organ system blocks, but we can show how students are performing by objective within each block. The other thing that happened concurrently here with the new curriculum was our iPad initiative. With that, we've given all of our incoming students an iPad. So now we're assured that all of our students have a device that can be used for computer-based testing, and more importantly for us, for implementation, that they were all on a common platform. So we really only had to worry about supporting one platform going forward, at least in the first year, for computer-based testing. So that's why we started using the computer-based testing. Now let's go to the meat of the talk, student acceptance. If the students aren't accepting of computer-based testing, we're going to get pushback as faculty and as administrators. They're going to be less comfortable and more anxious with the technology, which can adversely impact their performance. So we need to look at student acceptance factors. And the literature has looked at this going back all the way to the early 2000s and has shown us several things about student preferences, student concerns, and the ways in which students acclimate and accept technology over time. And we're going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. Students have a strong preference for writing on exams. In one study, 23% of students given a choice opted out of using computer-based testing, citing the reason that they wanted to be able to write on a paper exam. So this has been an important consideration in the literature. This compares to only 7% of students in that same study who opted out due to technology concerns. Now, technology concerns across the board are reported in the literature. Deutsch did a study in 2012 that showed technology concerns remain relevant long after successful implementation, and that many more students worry about technology failures than actually experience any technology failures. And we'll see how that played out here in just a few minutes, that technology concerns really do remain close to the surface and can bubble up quite easily. Looking at ease of use of the system, there was a lovely study that was done where they looked at various factors and did a statistical model of what feeds into a student's intention to use computer-based testing. And one of the three factors that fell out of this analysis was ease of use. The perceived ease of use on the part of the student drastically increases their intention to use computer-based testing in the future. And I'd like to talk for a minute about one of the factors that I think feeds directly into ease of use, and that is cognitive load. Now, historically, we associate cognitive load with instructional design and teaching rather than assessing. For those of you who aren't familiar with cognitive load, it's based on a couple of assumptions about cognitive capacity. The first is that we all have a working memory that can be thought of as holding 5 plus or minus 2 items at any point in time. For each individual, this is a fixed capacity. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is thought to be nearly a limitless capacity, although many of us as we age would argue with that. And this is where we store facts in schemas. So we integrate things from working memory into long-term memory, where they can then be pulled back out and worked with. Once a schema is pulled out of long-term memory, it can be manipulated in working memory as one of those items. So it becomes much more efficient once you have things encoded into long-term memory. That system then defines a cognitive capacity. And this cognitive capacity can be detracted from or loaded onto by 3 types of cognitive load. There's intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load. And these are additive. So you can have a lot of extrinsic load if you have very little extraneous and germane load. But if you're going to have more extraneous load or more germane load, you need to decrease the amount of intrinsic load, or you will overload the system and something that you didn't intend to will fall out of working memory and the student will experience more difficulty. Intrinsic load is sort of immutable. It is tied directly to the content. So the intrinsic load is, in the case of an assessment, what the student is reading, the different facts as part of the question that they need to keep track of, and what things they're pulling out of long-term memory, the schema that they're recalling, to try to come up with that correct answer. That's the intrinsic load. And our goal as educators and as evaluators is to keep as much cognitive capacity as possible open for that intrinsic load. Germane load is the part that goes along with learning. That's the part of the load that goes along with encoding these working memories into long-term memories, with pulling up the schema and incorporating it. It's actually a good type of cognitive load, and it really plays more of a role in learning than it does in assessing. So really, as an assessment, we don't need to be thinking so much about germane load. What we need to be worried about is that extraneous cognitive load. Extraneous cognitive load is everything else that the student is worried about or has to be concerned with. So how do you go on to the next question? How do I flag this question to come back to it? Can I cross out an answer? Is the system saving my answers? How much time do I have left? All of those things, including test anxiety, feed into extraneous cognitive load. And so our goal then is to try to decrease that as much as possible so that there's more cognitive capacity available for that intrinsic cognitive load, and our test results give us a more accurate representation of what the student knows rather than what types of extraneous load they're able to handle. One way to do that then is to acclimate the students to computer-based testing. And the way we did this was by using a mock examination. This was during our pilot year. So the mock quiz was made available to the students at the same time that they were asked to install the software, which was roughly 2 weeks prior to the pilot. This mock quiz for us served 2 purposes. And again, this is for our pilot. We've learned since then. The 2 purposes were to familiarize the student with the platform and to collect evaluation data in that order. We wanted the students to know a little bit about the platform that they'd be using, to understand a little bit about navigation and what kinds of questions they might come up with, what types of questions. And to do that, at the time we were thinking we just need to write a short quiz for them. Well, what kind of questions will we ask? Let's ask them things like, what operating system does your primary device run on? Or for the upcoming assessment, will I be bringing a laptop to class or using one of the lab computers? We also ask them questions about their greatest concern about computer-based testing, and we ask them to compare computer-based testing to paper-based testing in relation to how fast it was. So this mock quiz was sent out to the entire class of 188 students. It was downloaded by a little over half of them and completed by a total of 52% of the class. This number, 98, that actually completed the mock quiz becomes important later when we get to the actual pilot data. So when we asked the students what their greatest concern was about computer-based testing, this is what we found. 31.43% were concerned about technology glitches of one form or another. These students were in the second semester of their first year of medical school, so we'd had them for about a semester and a half at this point. That meant that they had some preconceived notion about the technology in our lecture hall. Specifically, there had been some issues with Wi-Fi connectivity in the lecture halls, and that gave the students cause for concern about how the technology would function in the case of an exam. Almost a third of the students expressed concern about being able to write on the exam. Now, for the purpose of this graph, writing on the exam includes crossing out items, writing notes, highlighting parts of the question, basically anything that you can do with a physical paper copy of the exam in front of you that you would not be able to do on the computer, or you would not apparently be able to do on the computer. As the students learned, you can actually cross out items. So for the pilot itself, we selected an optional low-stakes activity. We thought this was important to get the students used to using the technology and kind of see how it worked for them. What we did was to use an exam review in the physiology class. This was a 10-question quiz, and historically these exam reviews have been done with the students coming in, taking a brief 10-question quiz, and then having the faculty use that as a launching point for reviewing the content, going through question by question, foil by foil, and discussing what the correct answer was, why it was correct, why the other answers were incorrect. So it was a familiar format to the students. What was unfamiliar was just the computer-based testing, but also the fact that we did this in class in a secure format. And we did that in part to troubleshoot and make sure that we weren't going to have any issues with doing a secure exam with 188 students in the room. Now, when I say the pilot was optional, it was optional to come to the review. But if you came to the review and wanted to do the quiz, it had to be taken on ExamSoft. The students were not given the option of paper for this particular quiz. So again, the pilot quiz was sent out to 188 students, downloaded by 151 and completed by 120. That's 22 students more than did the mock quiz. And I can tell you it wasn't the same 22 students. What that meant was that for the 43 minutes that we had allotted to do, or 45 minutes that we had allotted to do this 10-question review, 15 of them were taken up getting students help downloading, registering, and installing the software. This delay turned out to be one of the concerns that was voiced then on the post-assessment or post-pilot evaluation. The post-assessment evaluation was sent out by Qualtrics later that same day. Qualtrics is the platform that we use for all of our course evaluations. So again, it's a platform that's very familiar to the students. We asked them again what the most challenging aspect of taking the quiz was. We asked them about the speed of computer-based testing compared to paper. And a new question, we asked them if they enjoyed using the computer. Overall, 64% of the students completed this pilot quiz, which is about 80% of those who downloaded it. And the average time of completion was about 23 minutes. So even though we ate into our 45 minutes that we were allowed, students still were able to complete the quiz, or at least most of them were able to complete the quiz in a reasonable amount of time. So asking them about their concerns after the pilot, we discovered that many of the concerns became much more specific, and several of the concerns indicated a need for further training on the software platform. This graph shows the pre-pilot concerns in gold, and the post-pilot concerns are shown in blue. And you can see that the concerns down here at the bottom for technology glitches dropped off dramatically to less than 10% once the students had been through the quiz. We also see up at the top that we've picked up some new concerns waiting to start, as I mentioned before, was mentioned as a concern by a little less than 5% of the students. Although we asked them what was specifically challenging about taking the exam on the computer, we did have almost 10% of students who cited question or direction specific concerns, which tended to be specific to the way a question was worded or tied into scrolling, that a question didn't tell them that they may need to scroll to see all of the options. And scrolling became a big issue with over 20% mentioning it. For this pilot, we had students on lab computers, we had students on their own laptops, and we had a handful of students who were on iPads. So the need to scroll actually, it was a little bit surprising to me that many students had a concern with it given the monitor size. And it was a little bit worrisome given that we were going to be going to iPads the following year where the monitor size was going to be significantly reduced. And we'll see how that comes up later. You can see right here we've got writing on exams and crossing out options. We split those out into two separate categories for the post-assessment analysis. And you can see that wanting to cross out options actually went up in level of concern compared to writing on exams overall. Of these, 4 areas were targeted that could be the subject for future training. The ability to cross out options, even on the iPad platform, is available to the students. They just weren't aware of it. Exam navigation and acclimation were thought to be amenable to further training, in that the more experience the students have with the platform, the easier navigation is going to be for them and the more comfortable they'll be. And software installation was listed as a concern by a number of students. And again, that's going to be sort of a one-time thing. Once they have the software installed and registered, that concern should drop off. So again, with acclimation, with more use of the system, that should drop off. So let's look at speed. We asked the students to compare the speed of the computer-based testing to the speed of taking the same test on paper. Again, pre-test is shown here in the gold, and post-test is shown here in blue. And not surprisingly, after taking the pilot test, the students found the computer to be slower than they did before taking the pilot test. The students did request, though, even with the concerns that they raised, even thinking that it was slower than they had thought it would be, the students requested that we continue to use ExamSoft for these exam reviews. And so we had the opportunity to run this pilot a second time and gather some of the same data. So on this chart, you'll see the original pre-pilot data shown in dark blue, time point 1, which is after their first assessment, shown in light blue, and you can see it starts to skew a little bit toward the slower side. But then after their second assessment, you can see that there's a statistically significant increase in the student's perception of speed, and that is statistically significant at less than the 0.05 p-value. In addition to asking about speed, we asked the students how they enjoyed using the computer for the assessment. We didn't ask this on the pre-pilot quiz, but we did after both of the pilot quizzes. When asked how they enjoyed it, enjoyment went up at the P of 0.01 level from, again, the first pilot shown here in blue and the second pilot shown here in red. So students enjoyed it more having used it 1 or 2 times, depending on if they took the mock quiz or not. So what could we conclude from the pilot? Students do, in fact, worry about technology failures, and again, that's been borne out in the literature. The one study that I cited where 7% opted out due to technology considerations. They have a strong preference for writing on the exam, again, borne out in the literature, and we saw that with our pilot. They do perceive the computer to be faster, and this is something that we saw develop over time, but it's been reported in the literature as well. A study going back as far as 2006, after a single implementation, 48% of the students thought computer-based testing was faster, and 37% of them thought it was no different from paper. So even going back to before computer-based testing was what it is today, students still tended to believe it to be faster than paper. A more recent study published in the Canadian Medical Education Journal in 2013 showed that 70% of students thought computer-based testing was a more efficient use of their time. We saw that students do acclimate rapidly to computer-based testing. In our case, after 2 uses, they're perceiving it to be significantly faster and their concerns are dropping off. That, again, has been borne out in the literature, that 2006 study showing that computer-based testing increases in preference after a single exposure. And then finally, we saw that the students' qualitative concerns grew more specific the more experience they had with the computer. And that's important to us because more specific concerns are easier to address. Sort of a global angst that the technology is going to fail is harder to address than students who are worried that if they get booted out of the exam in the middle, that their answers won't be saved. That's a specific scenario that we can address, whereas global angst is a little more difficult to address. So how did this inform our full-scale implementation? Going back and looking at those concerns that the students came up with, we decided to change the mock quiz in order to address some of these specific concerns. So exam navigation, crossing out items, flagging items, which ties into exam navigation, the use of the timer, and the use of the calculator were all targeted as areas that we wanted to address with our mock quiz. So on this mock quiz, we had 12 questions where we asked the students to do various things with the interface. We had them looking at images that were pop-ups. We had them looking at images that were embedded. We had them crossing out options and flagging the question to come back to later. We had them navigating back to that question 3 or 4 questions later when we gave them enough data to actually answer the question. We gave them items that could only be answered by using the calculator. We asked them to set the timer and at the end report how long it had taken them to take this pilot quiz. But we also asked them, again, their greatest concern about computer-based testing. And in this case, these are students who are just coming into our medical school, so they have no preconceived notions. In this case, what we saw was just about 21% were concerned with technology glitches, and about 18% were concerned with writing or highlighting or crossing off items, even after they had taken the initial quiz where they had the opportunity to cross out items and were directed to cross out items. So even though we had that training available, some of them still weren't getting the message. We had a number of them that were concerned about acclimating, and still almost 10% that were concerned about navigating within the system. Remember, I mentioned before that students remain concerned about technology even after a successful implementation. So here we see 20.71% of our students who were worried about a technology glitch. And that remained pretty constant after our first couple of implementations. But by the time we got to our 3rd exam, we had a little problem called iOS 8. Now, iOS 8 was released and it was pushed out to the students. And unfortunately for us, that occurred just before an exam and in too close a proximity for ExamSoft to get a patch out in time. So there were, in fact, some technology glitches with the formative quiz that preceded the exam. And that led to this pattern of concerns that were expressed by the students. Almost 42% of them now are concerned about technology going forward after a single instance of things going wrong. So we need to be mindful and be vigilant to these sorts of technology-related issues, because the students certainly are very sensitive to any perturbation in that system. We can see here as well, 14% of the students remained concerned about writing, highlighting, and crossing off items. That's a good number, in my opinion, given that we have almost a quarter of students that will opt out for those reasons. I think if we're down to 14% who express that as their primary concern, that we're doing a good job training them. Let's look at how the students perceive the speed of the computer compared to the speed of paper-based testing. On this chart, you can see the dark blue line is after the initial mock quiz. So the students had not had a real assessment yet. And we've got a beautiful bimodal distribution. If anything, it's skewed towards slower. Students believe it to be slower. There are some that perceive it to be faster, and there are really not very many who are in the middle. After the first implementation, we smooth out to much more of a bell curve there, shown in the light blue, where the students perceive it to be a little bit faster than they had previously. Skipping forward, to not make the chart too detailed here, we skip forward to our fourth implementation, which is the red line. And at that point, you can see that the students do believe it to be significantly faster, and this is at a p-value of 0.013. Comparing our implementation year to our pilot year, we can see here that our implementation year, shown in blue, believed the computer to be slower prior to actually using it for an exam. And that was statistically significant at less than the 0.01 level. So they came in believing it to be significantly slower than paper, or significantly slower than the class of 2017 thought it would be. But by the second implementation, that time point T2, they had evened out. So the students really were acclimating quite rapidly. You can see the positions had actually flipped at time point 1. I think that's confounded by the glitch that we had with the class of 2017 and that 15-minute delay getting started. But even so, we've evened out very well by time point 2. So the students are acclimating very rapidly to the computer, and they're showing an increased confidence in their ability to get through the material quickly. As with the class of 2017, we asked the students, how much more comfortable are you now than you were prior to the exam? Again, we didn't ask that on the pre-mock quiz. We asked it starting with their first actual quiz. And we see here that the line is a gradual slope going up. It is a statistically significant increase over time. The students are getting more comfortable with the software over time. But what's most interesting to me is when we ask them how strongly they prefer computer-based testing over paper-based testing, it's an almost identical curve. Likewise, statistically significant, but we can see that the more comfortable they are with the software, the faster they believe it to be, and the more they prefer it over paper. So what did we conclude from this? Students remain sensitive to technology failures, even when you've been successful. It takes very little to kind of spook the students into believing the technology is going to fail them. We also learned that it is possible to preemptively address some of the student concerns. Again, by changing our initial mock quiz, we were able to better orient the students to the software prior to their first high-stakes assessment. One thing that we learned with this mock quiz is we made it available to the students, and we'd asked the students to complete it prior to their first assessment. But we had students come to us after they had completed it and asked if they could do it again. So one thing that we learned was that we should be leaving this quiz open sort of as a tutorial, at least throughout the first semester. And I'll talk a little bit more about what else we're going to change with the mock quiz here in a moment. Again, consistent with what we learned in the pilot and what's in the literature, students do perceive it as being faster the more they use it. Students acclimate rapidly to computer-based testing in our experience after the second use. Things have statistically significantly improved in their comfort level, in their preference, in their perception of speed. And then finally, as they grow more comfortable, they prefer computer-based testing. So what do we do in the future? We need to tweak our mock quiz to better emphasize the navigational issues, and we need to continue to require it prior to their first quiz so that students are better acclimated before they do anything that's high stakes. We need to make the quiz available sort of in perpetuity so that they have it available as a tutorial. The other thing that we've learned is even though students all have an iPad and they've all been given an iPad, there are instances where students are preferring to take the quizzes or the tests on their laptops. And sometimes that's because they're taking it as a group and they want a little larger screen. Sometimes we've had a couple of iPad failures where students have brought in laptops. That's going to necessitate making a second mock quiz because the features work a little bit differently depending on which platform you're on. So we'll be modifying that mock quiz so that there's a version available for desktops and laptops. And then hopefully we'll be able to modify this mock quiz going forward as new features become available on the iPad. Not just the ability to cross out items, but perhaps the ability to highlight within questions. One last thing I need to do, I'd be remiss if I didn't, is to acknowledge Stephanie Sarandos and Lauren Kenda, who work here in the Office of Evaluation with me, and then Tracy Yarborough, who was the course director, who so graciously allowed us to use her students as guinea pigs in the pilot last year. And I've tried to leave plenty of time for questions, so I hope that you have some. With that, I'll open it up.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Wonderful presentation. We're going to go ahead and open up the forum for a Q&A session now. If you do have questions that you'd like to pose to Veronica, please go ahead and type them in the question area of the GoToWebinar control panel. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'm going to go ahead and read them out and give her an opportunity to answer. We've already had a couple come in, so let's go ahead and just dive right into them. Veronica, the first one is, how does keeping all students on a reliable Wi-Fi network at the same time work?
That was the beauty with ExamSoft, is that they don't need to be on a Wi-Fi network during the exam. They just need to have it available at the end of the exam for uploading. So we have bolstered the Wi-Fi within the lecture hall areas, and it seems to not be an issue this year. But I think the students, particularly in the pilot, who had had issues in that room didn't realize that the exam delivered through ExamSoft would be housed locally on their machine and that they wouldn't need to have a continuous Wi-Fi connection.
Okay, and follow-up question to that that just came in is, how do the exam files get onto the device?
We make them available for the students to download in advance of the exam, typically 2 days in advance. They can be downloaded from anywhere, and they're downloaded in an encrypted format. So the student can download it at home a couple of days before the exam. It sits on their device, but it's encrypted, and the student can't access it until they get to the secure testing environment where they're given the password that they need to access the exam.
Wonderful, thanks. Next question is, how did faculty react to this implementation process?
As you could expect, there were some varied responses. Initially, with the change in curriculum, we did have a couple of faculty here who actually were asking for ExamSoft or something like it. They wanted to be able to collect those sorts of discipline-specific metrics. Asking the faculty to do anything new, sort of above and beyond their full-time job already, is always a bit of a burden, and it can be a bit of a struggle. So asking them to tag all of their questions is an additional task that we've asked them to do. And I believe there was some reluctance to do that initially. However, once they saw the data that we were able to provide them after the first block of examinations where we could show them discipline by discipline how the students had performed, that resistance went away. They wanted the data and they were willing to do what needed to happen to make that work.
Great, thank you. Next question is, with the exams being downloaded onto the iPad, how quickly does the memory fill up, or are they deleted after the exam's been taken?
Once you've uploaded the exam, at the end, you upload your exam file, the exam itself is deleted from the iPad. And we haven't run into any memory issues yet, and we've made it through an entire first year where we've done every exam and every formative quiz on the iPad.
Great. Next question is, how did you keep the students from using the home key to exit out of the exam and accessing other apps on the iPads?
That's something that comes with the ExamSoft platform. It's a secure testing platform, or it can be delivered in a secure testing platform, which we've opted for using for all of our assessments. And to get into that secure testing platform, the student has to put their device in airplane mode and in something called as a guided access, which means that they are not able to access other applications without exiting that status. If they exit that status, it boots them out of the exam, and they need to have a resume code to get back in. So any student who decides they're going to take it out of airplane mode or drop out of guided access gets booted out of the exam and has to ask the proctor for a resume code to get back into the exam. The one thing we learned, speaking of the secure exam mode, is that Bluetooth is allowed in the secure exam mode so that students can use a Bluetooth keyboard to enter items, say if there's an essay question. So we did learn that after we got started, that students don't need to type out on the screen, because on an iPad, by the time you put up a keyboard and you've got the question, the area that you have to be able to answer the question really becomes quite small.
Great, thank you. This looks like the last one that we have, so if you do have a question, last call for questions. Veronica, how hard is the exam creation process on the back end for faculty members, and do I need a team for this?
I think it depends on how you intend to implement it. It is possible with ExamSoft to have faculty enter their own questions into the system and then have the course. First off, let me back up. In a medical school, typically we have 20 or 30 faculty teaching in a course with a specific course director. So it's a little different model than, say, undergraduate schools might have. It is possible to have each one of those 20 or 30 faculty enter their own questions into ExamSoft and then have the course director choose from those questions and construct the exam. We opted not to do it that way, in part because it would require training all of those faculty to use ExamSoft, where many of them may be giving 1 or 2 talks and have to enter in between 3 and 6 questions. So what we decided to do was to collect all of the questions electronically and have someone centrally enter them all into ExamSoft for the faculty. The course directors do have access to ExamSoft, and they go in and construct the exams within ExamSoft. But entering the questions initially, we're doing centrally. Where we found the labor to be able to do that was as we switched to ExamSoft, we no longer needed the person who was doing all of our Scantron scoring. And so the person who previously had been doing the Scantron scoring is now taking these emailed and Word document questions that are entered in and entering them into ExamSoft for us. So there's a couple of different ways to implement this, and it really depends on how many faculty you're talking about. If we were talking about 3 or 4 faculty for a course, I would absolutely prefer to leave it in the hands of the faculty and have them enter their questions and be able to edit their questions themselves.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for your presentation this afternoon, Dr. Michaelsen. Once again, folks, thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon to come listen to the presentation. We know this is a very busy time of year, so we appreciate your time. Just a quick reminder, this webinar has been recorded, and we will be sending out an email in the next couple of days with a link to the recording for you to view or share as you would like. Also, as soon as this presentation closes out, you will get a pop-up on your screen with about 5 questions and a survey. We really would appreciate if you would take just a few seconds to answer those questions so we can continue to provide relevant content at these webinars. With that, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. Thank you so much and enjoy your afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Michaelsen.
Thank you, Stephanie.